Today, I am joined by Cameron Forbes, an event planner known for her incredible taste and gracious hosting style. Cameron is the founder of Forbes Functions, a boutique event firm that brings together elevated design and hospitality in celebrations big and small. We talk all about her path into the world of event planning, how her background and personal style shape the way she serves her clients, and we get into her favorite tips for warm weather entertaining. Think outdoor dinner parties, beach picnics, signature touches for summer gatherings, how to bring charm and intention into hosting no matter the guest list. This is just chock full of ideas, heart, and a lot of charm. I hope you enjoy. Welcome to Grandma's Silver, where tradition meets today. I'm Allie, your host of the Grandma Silver podcast and founder of the Grand Millennial Lifestyle. Here, we blend aesthetics with nostalgia, engaging in conversations with lifestyle brands, designers, and more to rediscover the timeless charm of the past. Join me as we journey from home to heart, illuminating the past and polishing the present with the gleam of Grandma Silver. Cameron, welcome to the pod.
Thank you so much for having me, Allie.
I am super excited to dive right in. We were just talking a moment ago. This is one of my passions as well, this conversation. So I'm super excited to just dive into it. And we're getting into a really fun season, also a busy season, which we can talk about. But go ahead and introduce yourself and tell people a little bit more about who you are and what you're doing.
Yeah, so my name is Cameron Forbes, and I am the founder of Forbes Functions, which is a boutique luxury event planning company based in New York City and the Hamptons. We really specialize in, making really memorable events, whether that's brand, influencer, or for private clients. And we really run the gamut, everything from small intimate dinners all the way up to large VIP weddings and galas and brand events. And I started the business in 2022 when I was actually 23. I'm a born and raised New Yorker and have now had the business here for almost 3 years.
Amazing. I started mine when I was 23 too. There must be something to that number.
It's so fun. And, when I started my business originally, I was like, am I too young to do this? But I was like, if not now, when?
Yeah, and honestly, girl, you need the energy.
No, I'm better to do it when I don't have like a
do it
mortgage
now.
and a husband and 6 dogs and kids.
100%, 100%. Of course, you were, if we talk about age, right? Like you were on the younger side, but I also fully understand it. Was this what you've always wanted to do? Like, what was your background before this?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it definitely is something I've always had an interest in. I always say I was a generational hostess, or I am a generational hostess. My mom is a florist. My grandmother was like the ultimate hostess back in the 70s. And so growing up, entertaining was a big part of my life. And then during college, when I went to Duke University, North Carolina, I had a couple different opportunities in public relations and design. And so kind of, getting closer to that storytelling and the aesthetic and the creativity kind of felt very second nature to me. And I actually graduated college amidst the global pandemic, which, oh, so fun. And so I actually ended up working in banking for 2 years before I started Forbes Functions. Again, it was really just about, I was helping so many friends with parties. I was kind of that master of ceremonies for friends and family. And I felt there was a gap in the market in the city for events that are elevated, but that didn't feel overly formal or like there was a ton of red tape. And that's kind of how Forbes Functions was born.
I love that. Now, I also love that you come from a creative family. So how did that, I mean, I have to imagine you were around that quite a bit growing up. How did that play in, or like, how do you feel that it contributed or helped you? Because a lot of people don't have that access.
Growing up, hosting, it wasn't just something that we did. It was truly an art form, as you said, and it was truly something, a creative outlet for my mother and my grandmother and a lot of the women in my family. And I think, I absorbed so much early on, seeing just how they made our friends and family and other people feel special through small, thoughtful design touches. Just a little extra 15 minutes can go a long way. And I think that really motivated me, seeing how, the women in my life have such a strong strength for gathering people and creating a sense of community. And I think that really inspired me from a young age. And, even when I look back to college at Duke, I was, social chair of my sorority. I was always planning all the different events. And I think I've always kind of been someone who just loves hosting and entertaining.
I think a lot of that's coming back post COVID. And we can talk about this a little bit.
Yeah.
There is a generational pool to entertain again. Whereas when I was in college and right out of graduation, and we were all getting our first homes and apartments, and you didn't see as much of that. But I love seeing now, of course, I'm on Instagram and TikTok, and I see a younger generation, the generation right below me. I say that like I'm 80 years old, but I see people in their 20s and early 30s starting to entertain more, which I love.
No, 100%. And I think that's, just a trend that I've seen and is one of the reasons I started the business after the pandemic was just I felt like coming out of COVID 2021, 2022, people just really wanted to get together.
Mhm.
And then I felt like, simultaneously with, the rise of TikTok, these other platforms, it was also not just, hosting the event for yourself, but it's also, sharing it on social media, being able to provide and show kind of your flair on your socials and share it with friends and family. I think, that has really also inspired people to put a little bit more thought and detail into their events.
And it's funny that you're talking about social media, which I would love to hear a little bit more about this. If now's the time, great. If not, we can talk about it later. But when I had my company, we would post, but social media was not I say platform loosely. Now you have entire teams dedicated to capturing weddings, milestone
Yeah.
events on social. How do you integrate that into, I mean, are people wanting now to do things for social media? Like, is that a
I think
conversation that
so.
they're coming into you and having? Like, we want this captured on social this way.
Both of my creator brand and then private clients, I'm always hearing the terms like, I want this to be super Instagrammable. I want to have lots of photo moments because people want to not only have people come to their event, but they also want to be able to wake up the next morning and be scrolling their feed and have all those memories of the night before, come flooding back. With my private clients, it's a lot about, okay, how do we want to do content capture, whether that's, having an on-site wedding day content creator in tandem with our photographer and videographer. And then with brand clients, right now it's like we're in the midst of Coachella. There's so many different activations and pop-ups and things happening. And so I think with brands, it's also, very much how can we be creating things that will go viral on social? What are really cool visual moments that we think will get a lot of traction? There are positive and negatives to that because, I don't think you should ever do something just for socials. I think it should always have, an in-person interactive component. But I also think, it's allowed brands who invest a lot in their event marketing to see, really big returns. If you think about, brands like an 818 that are doing a lot of different activations and influencer pop-ups or an Unwell.
I want to talk about this a little bit more when we talk more about design. The way you're going into the conversation with your client looks a lot different than maybe some are used to even now, depending on what they specialize in. I find it super fascinating because, and one of the things I was going to ask you now was, as an event planner, you also do a bit of design work, right? There's
Yes.
event design. And so I would love to hear, much like an interior designer, your job is to work with your client's vision and execute their vision, but you also come into it with your own flair and your own aesthetic. How would you describe that for yourself?
I would say definitely I lean very colorful. I lean very maximalist. I like things that feel very whimsical and surrealist. As you were saying, as an event planner, number one is always the client's vision and executing that. But we also have a lot of clients that will come to us because of our kind of aesthetic and kind of our imprint in the design world in the city. I think one of the reasons why a lot of brands and private clients come to us is because they want kind of more of a youthful look. Whereas I feel like some of my competitors in the city who maybe have been working in the industry for 10, 20, 30 years, the events may feel like, there hasn't been a lot of evolution over the last 30 years. When I think about my aesthetic, again, it's eclectic, it's maximalist, it's fun. And it's also, like I said, incorporating kind of the old and the new things I learned from my mother and grandmother, but also things that I'm finding on TikTok and Amazon and, other places online.
I'd love to hear a little bit more, especially because you're working with both social and for lack of a better word, like brand or corporate events, right? How are you drawing inspiration? If we can segment those a second, because they're very different kinds of events.
I am constantly finding inspiration, whether it is, through other design resources or whether it's social media or Pinterest. When I think about how we approach our private clients and our brand and corporate clients, I think we do a great job at navigating, whatever those brand assets requirements are, along with, trying to infuse as much of a cohesive but fun and youthful vision as we can. Something that allows us to do that is the fact that my team is also all women under 30. So we're the same age as a lot of these guests and attendees. So a lot of the time we try to think about, okay, what would we personally like or what would our friends be interested in? Because a lot of the events that we're planning are events that, the New York City influencers are going to and they're in their mid, late 20s. But I think as far as sources of inspiration, just so many. And I think that's one of the things about social media that is so impactful. And when I talk to my mentors who were working in event planning in the 80s or 90s, it's like you didn't have, if I'm having a moment where I'm like, oh, I'm kind of in a slump, it's like I have Pinterest right at my fingertips. And I feel like that just makes everything so easy as opposed to, having to cut through magazines.
You said you do some weddings?
Yes, I also
Yeah.
do weddings.
Okay. Yeah. So, what I always found interesting, and I'd love to hear how you navigate the conversation, because when I was planning, Pinterest was it. Pinterest was what everyone was using. And I would get people bringing me their boards or, their pictures, and they would want me to just copy the Pinterest board, which you obviously can't do. What do you like to tell your clients? Because, of course, the idea would be let's draw inspiration from this rather than mimic it. How do you take when people come to you with whether it's Pinterest, TikTok, Instagram, whatever it is that they're bringing your way as a source of inspiration? How are you steering your client in a direction where you can customize something that's more personal to them that still pulls from what inspires them?
When we have clients, and a lot of the times, even as you were saying, even in 2025, we have so many people that will come to us and be like, here's my Pinterest board. We also definitely have a lot of people who will send us over, like, here's a bunch of screenshots from Instagram or TikTok. For me, it's always about, asking the client, okay, like, what do you like from this? Is it that you really like kind of like the moody coloring of the florals? Do you really like the textures and how there's a mix of different linens and weaves and things like that? And then, kind of pulling out those elements that they want to prioritize, whether it's like, yes, you know what, like the draping florals are my number one. And then, connecting with our vendors from our network and seeing, okay, what is your take on this? What's the way that you think we could do something similar, but maybe elevate it or tweak it a little bit more to fit the venue or the client's, specifications, and thinking about what the client really wants to have and then kind of going from there and kind of prioritizing those different event elements allows us to, achieve whatever that client vision is, but also make sure it's uniquely personal to them. Because as I'm sure you know, it's like we have clients who, even especially with weddings, it's like we'll have clients who it's like my number one thing is the florals. And then it's like, that's great. And we have other clients where it's like all I care about is the videography. And so it really is on a case by case basis and evaluating what they think is most important, what they want to prioritize really allows us to then, go through and figure out with vendors and with design how we want to lead.
The city and the Hamptons, like those are two different vibes, right? So how do you do you have a preference of not what area you prefer, but what you bring to each of those aesthetics?
I'm very fortunate, again, being born and raised in New York City and just growing up here. I have such a great network here of so many of my friends, family members, people that I've known since I was little, are now people that are involved in the industry or in hospitality. And so I think, that really gives me kind of a leg up with a lot of my competition in terms of just really knowing kind of the lay of the land. And I think it's very similar in the Hamptons. My parents met out there. I was born out there and have been going out there again since I was, a month old. Again, understanding what are the kind of under the radar venues, who are the vendors, if you're in a pinch in the Hamptons. And for example, we had an event last summer where BBJ Tavola sent us the wrong number of linens. It's about having those relationships where I can call up Becky from Bermuda Parties and be like, hi, Becky, I need you to get someone to run me 8 linens right now. And so I think it's really all to me about having those relationships and having that network, growing up in these places and, making natural relationships and being able to now take advantage of those for my business and also help so many of my friends and family who are also in hospitality or other industries is really fun. Yeah.
I want to go back for 1 second to your mom being a florist. I don't know how involved you were or like how much you've seen the back end of that, but do you feel that there was any leg up in that space for you going into planning? Because there's a lot, if we're talking about event design, there are a lot of mimicked elements that, space, scale, all those sorts of things play
Yeah.
into both arenas. So was there anything that you felt you already kind of had a pretty good comfort level with?
Yes, and I think with my mom being so involved in floristry, gardening, also hosting and entertaining, I think number one, I can always do a great flower arrangement. I've learned that at an early age, so that's great. But I would say beyond that, again, as you're saying, learning just like early design principles in terms of, as you were saying, space, scale, depth, dimension, composition. I think, all of that was something that even if I didn't know what it was called, I was learning from a young age. And
Hmm.
I think, as I've now grown my business and I've learned also professionally, okay, this is what it is, that's carried through her network and her relationships, people in the industry as well, whether it is venues or other event planners. It also really set me up when I was starting my business where I had a lot of great mentors that I could reach out to who I'd known from a young age because it was like, my mom's really good friend who's a caterer, things like that, which really just, I feel like allowed me to get really like a great sense of the business and a perspective before, I really even got involved.
I love that. I came from a venue background, so I had a very similar, I felt like it was a very seamless transition, which was nice.
And even now, it's like, I feel like sometimes it's like, especially when I'm out in the Hamptons, it's like I'm literally calling so many of the people that, my mom's friends, people I just grew up with. That is so invaluable. And I think even with my grandmother, who wasn't really as involved, she was someone who never went to like design school, never went to college, but just understood on a kind of natural level, had that kind of basic instinct for what goes together, what doesn't. And I think that's something that you're kind of born with like the taste and style, but you also can kind of just learn it and you kind of pick it up.
Well, it also sounds like it might have been passed down, which is lovely. Before we segue into kind of the second half of this conversation, which I
Yeah.
think will be super fun, I think people will be excited about. I wanted to ask because, much again, like interior designers, I think people don't realize how many conversations and how much you have to get to know your client on the event planning side in order to really personalize an event for them. Whether that is, an engaged couple that's getting married or a brand that you have to really understand who they are, like at their core, in order to execute an event that tells their story. What are some of those conversations or things that you personally like to ask, whether it be a questionnaire or conversations you have in person that really help you to get to know the essence of your client?
I have my questionnaire that, has the classic event questions in terms of like, who, what, when, where, why, etc. I am someone where all of our kind of intake, we don't have like an inquiry form. We don't do like any sort of cold emails. In order to work with us, you have set up a call with me or someone on my team. And I think that is kind of like my first line of defense in finding clients, being able to understand their vision, making sure that they align with kind of our brand and our ethos. I'm sure you found, Ali, as well as you worked longer in the industry, you start to get an instinct that like, in those first 5, 10 minutes of an intake call or first conversation, we're going to work well together, or maybe this isn't the best client to take on. 3 years in, I feel like I can tell pretty quickly based off of our first few minutes of conversation if we're going to be working together or if it isn't, the most natural fit.
It's also such a great, beautiful space to enter when you don't have to take them, when you know it's
Yes.
not going to be a good fit. And you're right. It's just, there is a feel. You can just tell. Now, one of the things that I wanted to kind of talk about today was, of course, the weather is warming up slowly but surely. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about entertaining in the warmer weather, right? So, it's such a big entertaining season, especially because you kind of do a little of the city, a little of the Hamptons, like you're kind of all over. So, first and foremost, do you have favorite things that are going on in each of those areas during the summer months? In terms of why maybe each of those areas might be exciting or special to have an event.
My favorite time of the year probably for events, even though it really is our high season, it can be really go, 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 is the summer. My team pretty much moves out to the Hamptons on June 1st, and we're pretty much there until October 1st. Being out there, not only is it so exciting and, we're surrounded by people that are doing really exciting similar things. When I'm out there and I'm going to the beach and I'm in the backyard, it also just lends spring, summer inspiration. Being out there really inspires me. Similarly, summer events in the city, I feel like it definitely is quieter in the city during the summer. We have a lot less events here, but the events we do have here, it is also a little bit even more fun for the city in the summer because there's less going on and it can feel like people just don't have as much going on in the city. So it can be really fun to have like, okay, a Wednesday in July, we're doing this big thing. It can just feel nice to kind of break up the kind of quietness in the city in the summer.
What, just on a personal level, not even necessarily what you're posting for your clients, but what are some of your favorite things about entertaining during the spring, summer seasons?
I just feel like entertaining during the spring and summer is truly like so easy. When I'm hosting at home in the winter, if I'm hosting, Thanksgiving or Friendsgiving or a holiday party, everyone is kind of trapped in my apartment or my home. And I need to make sure we have everything we need and the decor and everything looks good and the apartment is clean. Whereas I feel like with spring, summer, when you get into outdoor entertaining, it can be really as simple as, cracking a bottle of wine, having, a few appetizers, and sitting on a porch, a bench, wherever outside, doing an outdoor picnic in Central Park. I love just, the indoor outdoor nature of it. And I also just, I think I love the spring summer color palette. Some of my favorite spring summer events to host, I do a lot of beach picnics. I do a lot of Sunday dinners, sunset dinners, smaller stuff. I just feel like in the summer, it is so easy to gather and get together. And that's why it's definitely one of my favorite times of year.
I love that. Now you touched on color, which
Yes.
I love to talk about at all times. So what are some of do you have any like go-to tried and true palettes that you pull from that time of the year?
I'm someone who I kind of lean classic. I love a soft color. I love a pastel. Again, kind of going back to my maximalist kind of eclectic aesthetic. I love getting funky and pairing that with maybe something that's more bold, vibrant, the pastels with like super colorful citrus and giving it kind of a surrealist spin, garden party with an edge. I think I'm really attracted to that right now. I always love grand millennial decor, but I feel like in the summer, especially, is when I'm just like, I want to be living in a Nancy Meyers movie and I want everything to be, shades of blue and white and neutral. And I think also, especially being out in the Hamptons,
I was just about to say that
there's a
environment
lot of
is
that kind of
perfect.
New England coastal grandmother aesthetic. And so a lot of our summer events are those kind of classic summer event elements you think about, whether it's, having those rattan chargers, having the hydrangea elements that are, shells, things like that. And so I think those are some of my kind of favorite spring summer vibes.
I love that you touched on Grand Millennial, not just because obviously we talk about a lot here, but because I think a lot of people see Grand Millennial and they see it online. It's a little too prim and proper for their taste, but it also tends to kind of connect to maximalism in a way, which I find to be slightly edgier, which I actually love. I feel like your brand has just like a little fresh, it's got a little edge. How do you like to kind of break up that feel, right? Because I have to imagine I can't personally picture you going out into the Hamptons and just throwing this big Nancy Meyers party. I feel like there's an edge.
A great example is we did a party, I guess, 2 summers ago now. That was Nancy Meyers meets Wyoming.
Oh
So
my God, I love
it was
that.
like that was literally the theme. So it was like kind of like coastal Western coastal cowgirl inspired. We are always thinking about, what can we do to elevate what we already have in mind? What can we do to put that little spinner twist on it? And I've also, I literally said this to someone the other day. I don't want to be the person who, when I'm out in the Hamptons, every single weekend is, the hydrangea blue and white dinner party. When I talk to clients, I like to always have those conversations in terms of, okay, what is something that you really love? What are things you want to prioritize? What's something unique you'd want to throw in? So that we can make it as personalized to them as possible because I never want to have any of my events none should ever, no event should ever be similar to another. I want all of my clients to have events that really speak to them. So, as you said, I think it's always about putting an edge, a twist on kind of what we already have, whether that's a grand millennial aesthetic, whether that's using kind of those older generational items like a candelabra and getting funky with them. I think that's what really excites me and, is also a fun challenge.
I find it, when we're talking about like the Nancy Myers aesthetic, right, which is huge right now. That's talk about TikTok, like that's everywhere, unless that's just
Yeah.
my algorithm. But it's very much, I feel like the cool thing about hosting in the Hamptons, right, is that you have the edgy atmosphere of the city moving.
Yes.
Whereas the Nancy Myers aesthetic, which is a little more, I would argue, like New England coastal, is pulling more from the New England area, which tends to be a little more preppy, prim
Yeah.
proper. So, do you see that in the way that people are wanting to entertain in the Hamptons versus perhaps a New England?
Hamptons, the entertaining, it's kind of it's a mix and it's all about the balance. So it's, we're going to be laid back and barefoot, but we're going to have a very elegant and elevated tablescape. Even right now, we're planning an event for a client in July. It's his 50th. He's having like a beautiful sit down dinner, but we're also having fire pits and sparklers and all of these other interactive elements. And so I think with the city, it's kind of having that little bit of drama and flair and edge. It keeps that because, at its core, again, it's like the Hamptons is very laid back, chill, beachy, but then having a little bit of that New York kind of elegance, luxury, kind of chicness to it.
Mhm. Okay, let's this this is kind of out of left field, but not. You were touching on the 50th beach picnics even. So for people who are not wanting to entertain but are not super familiar or are intimidated by the idea of putting a table together or how to do something that looks beautiful in a casual environment like a beach, what do you recommend for the must-haves, the go-to elements that they should be thinking about?
Really depends on what type of event you're having, but I always just try to think about first off, whether it's beach, whether it's at home. Okay, like we always need to have something in front of guests. What are we doing for food and beverage? And like that can be as simple as some wine to the beach and a couple of snacks or fresh fruit or whatever it is. My second set is the kind of food and beverage and then always kind of the ambiance. So whether that's okay, if you're doing it at home, do we want to have like some of that coastal grandmother New England aesthetic? Or, if we're hosting on the beach, do we want to have fun, like different lighting, like candles and string lights and lanterns? Another thing with outdoor hosting and just hosting in the summer in general is having a backup plan just because the weather can be crazy, whether it's hot, whether it's raining, being able to go inside, having the umbrellas, having the tents, the fans are all really helpful. And then I think another thing that I just always think about, no matter kind of the time of year, is just kind of the flow of the event
Mhm.
and, how guests will be experiencing the event. Thinking about, do I want to create zones? So do I want to have like a lounge area? Do I want to have different bars, positions, whatever it is, how the guests will actually experience the space in the event.
I talk about experience all the time, and I love that you just did too, because I think depending who you talk to, experience isn't the first thing that comes to mind. The aesthetic, the overall look is, and both are important when you're
Yeah,
entertaining, but that experience is really the driving factor for events. So I
100%.
appreciate that you touched on that. You did also say something which is really interesting because I always love to figure out where people like what people like to use as a starting point when they're doing a tablescape, for instance. So some will say, I start with a linen. Others will say, I start with a flower. Others will say, I start with the China pattern that I'm using. You just touched on menu, which is I think really neat because that can set the tone. Often your menu is influenced by the venue, environment, space.
Yes.
So would you say that you often will start with that and then build upon it? Or like if you're starting with a table, what are you pulling first?
If I'm hosting at home or, something simple and I'm starting with the table, it really is okay. Like, is there a focal piece? Is there kind of like a big visual moment that I want to focus on? As we're talking about Grand Millennial, I have lots of beautiful vintage and antique chinoiserie pieces. Do I want to pull some of those and have that be a focal point and then build off that centerpiece and pull my other blue and white and other fun items? Or do I want to start with, okay, I'm really into these plates I have that have, beautiful cherries on them and then think about how I want to do kind of that red and green or that fruit forward aesthetic. For me, I think it's always about kind of picking like one piece of inspiration and building around that. And, as we were talking about earlier, taking that one piece and thinking, okay, like how can I make use of space and depth and dimension and all these different design tenets to create, the most beautiful composition for this tablescape.
Now you touched on your chinoiserie collection, which was something I wanted to talk to you about, not that specifically, but the fact that I think sometimes people who are either new to this or just are very traditional, right, get it in their mind that the centerpiece must be floral, which
Yes.
and I'm sure you would agree, understanding your background, we love a flower. Like
I
we
love
love
a
flowers.
flower.
But could you talk about some more of those unexpected elements that could also work as a focal point on a table?
For example, my 12 different chinoiserie taper candle holders, or whether it's bringing out some beautiful like ginger jars. I love anything rattan or woven, different woven elements and shapes and animals. I also love like any sort of candelabra or dramatic candle moment. I think one thing that's inexpensive and always looks beautiful is like just tons of pillar candles and hurricane holders. And I'm also, of the mind that sometimes you don't even need to have necessarily a centerpiece, but maybe it's having a focal piece that's above the table. So, an easy hanging installation. I did one back in December above my dining room table, just all kind of ornaments on this different hanging from a different trellis. And, that was absolutely beautiful and super low lift and inexpensive. So I don't think it necessarily needs to be, we're spending the $200 on a huge centerpiece. I think it can be, making use of what you have. And that's something that I always try to do is think about, even if it's something that maybe isn't meant for the table, like, oh, I have this cool piece of silver or whatever it is, pulling those elements in. And I think, one thing we've seen recently is, people are really into the fruit and bringing in, like citrus and having candles in the bread and candles in different fruits and vegetables. Really just thinking outside of the box. There are just so many different ways you can create, a really beautiful centerpiece and create that beautiful kind of visual moment.
Turning to flowers for 1 second, if people especially are not familiar with the floral world at all, are there flowers in the warmer months that you turn to put on a table?
I love classics and I love flowers that are just hardy in the summer because, it's hot. Summer is not the time where personally, like, I don't want to be, spending a ton of money on like fresh peonies or something that, maybe isn't out of season or isn't local. So I like just love local things during the summer, whether that's wildflowers. In the Hamptons, it tends to be like sunflowers, hydrangea, obviously. I love anything that's really hardy and can kind of survive the elements in the summer. Whatever I have on hand is kind of like what I like to make work. So, when I'm hosting myself in the Hamptons, that really is sunflowers and hydrangea and wildflowers. That will really be the kind of the basis for my floral arrangement and whatever I'm kind of doing with florals out there. It differs for clients. We have some clients who are like, let's import from Argentina this flower I want. But I think I'm definitely someone who, in the spring and summer leans local, especially just, for longer events where the flowers are going to be outside for, 8, 10, 12 hours.
Well, you've touched on the elements a couple of times, so this feels like a good time to talk about contingency plans and
Yes.
things that people, even if they're hosting at home, are dealing with. So things like the heat, weather, bugs. So what kinds of things could you recommend that would alleviate some of that as a host, especially if they're not used to maybe entertaining outside or do need to have some kind of a backup plan in mind?
I mean, I always am someone who says, have a plan B and a plan C. The weather, bugs, everything. I think, you can always have your contingency plans of bringing the umbrellas, bringing the picnic blankets, bringing whether it's citronella candles or bug spray. But I think at the end of the day, hosting entertaining is really about being able to roll with the punches.
Mhm.
And so if that means, you're sitting on the beach and it starts raining, and we move the beach picnic into the car and we figure out the next spot. I think it's about, really just being able to enjoy the moment, keep your guests feeling entertained and having a good time. Even if it's like, the downpour is coming, we got to move everything to the car, being calm and relaxed because guests will kind of feel the way you're feeling. And guests can tell if you're stressed, not having a good time, that's going to rub off on them, even if the event is the most fabulous thing ever and it's super aesthetic and super beautiful.
Now, what about if people are looking to do something more spontaneous? Because a lot of us who are hosting at home, it could be just like the sun is out, it's a beautiful day, let's get everybody together. So,
Yeah.
do you have anything that you recommend people either keep on hand or that like those little tiny priorities that they should be focusing on to ensure that the event impromptu as it may be, that it still has an impact?
I definitely always like to keep in my fridge and in my apartment, like I always have a bar cart that's fully stocked just in case. I always like to have, a bottle of red and white in my fridge. I'm also not a big of a drinker, but just you never know who's going to come over. So I think being, making sure you're stocked with beverages, things like that, so that, if it turns out, you wake up on Saturday morning and it's a beautiful day, you can text in the group chat and be like, everybody come over in the next hour and you're kind of already ready. The same thing with easy kind of food and drink, appetizers. I always have random Wegmans frozen foods or a couple different cheeses, just things you can throw together that are great little snacks, things for people to nosh on. Once you kind of have food and beverage, it's just again about the ambience. So whether that's okay, I'm gonna quickly, vacuum my space and clean it up a little bit, or the lawn and bring some furniture outside. It really is simple, and it's just, about making sure that guest needs can be met and that you can also enjoy yourself and you're not scrambling during the event.
Well, and that goes back to what you were talking about earlier, right? Which is that your guests feed off of your energy.
Yeah, and I
Very
think that's
true.
why it's like to me, it's it's worth it to just keep a bottle of Kim Crawford and a thing of Boursin in the fridge, which cost me all of $30. Who could come over tomorrow? You never know, but I'm prepared and I have kind of everything I want. I don't feel empty-handed.
I'm kind of ping-ponging, so bear with
No
me. But
worries.
if people are planning with something more long-term, it could be impromptu, but if it's more long-term, they've had time to think about this. We kind of touched on earlier, like different clients have different priorities. Some
Yeah.
are really gung-ho about the menu and the food, and that is like where they want their money to go. Some are all about the music and the dance floor. Some are all about the aesthetic that you mentioned, videography. So what sorts of things do you like to tell people? Like, how do you number one, get people to identify those priorities? And number two, if we're talking about like summer entertaining, keeping things a little more casual, but where you still have those priorities, what sorts of things do you like them to kind of think about for themselves to figure out? Because even when you're having something small at home, ideally, you would have some kind of an idea or a sense of how much you're willing to spend, your budget, that kind of thing.
I always, when I'm trying to get clients to think about, what they want to prioritize, what's important to them, I always like to ask, what are some of the parties you've been to in the past that you absolutely enjoyed? Or what are some of the favorite things that, you've been able to enjoy at a party or an event in the last year? What are some of the things that, maybe you went to a wedding last year that you didn't love? Getting that information then allows me to say, okay, they really do not love having the 10-person bridal party. They want to keep it small. They want to have, the ceremony be short and sweet because they've been sitting through a bunch of long ones. Or kind of similar to you, if they say, we're both huge foodies, okay, well, that flags to me. We want to dedicate more budget to that. It's always for me just about being really transparent with my clients and having them be as transparent as possible with me. And then I definitely am not someone who will sugarcoat things. Like I'm honest to clients and I'll say, if a client comes to me with a beautiful picture of, Hailey Bieber's wedding and is asking how much it's going to cost to have tulips covering the entire wall, I'm going to be honest. Sometimes that puts me as an event planner and a wedding planner as kind of the Debbie Downer, but I think it's important to have someone in that role.
You need to be.
And I
You have to
think,
set the
yeah.
expectation. Yeah.
And I think setting expectations is so important. And I think, one of the other things I try to do with Forbes Functions and with our social media is also just be really transparent about the cost of the industry, especially with weddings and larger events. Because even I've seen as someone who thinking about my own wedding in the next year or two, you go on the knot and it's like, oh, the average wedding is $30,000. Then you talk to brides and it's completely off base. So transparency and just having that open client relationship is so important. And I think, as you said earlier, Ali, that's why it's also, I'm so fortunate at this point, 3 years in, to be able to be a little bit pickier with my clients, always picking brides that, I know I will connect with and that we're going to be able to work through that process together. Brides that will be transparent with me and brides that, feel comfortable talking about these things.
Well, and I think it goes back to what you're talking about right now, goes back to sort of the plight that I used to deal with the Pinterest boards being shoved in my face, right? Was because it wasn't only about them saying, I want to copy this, but sometimes it was me having to say, you can't afford that based on the budget we've been working on. And
Yeah.
I think a lot of people don't realize that at least on Pinterest, a lot of the time. Maybe not so much now. I feel like there's a little more reality on Pinterest these days, but a lot of that was styled shoots.
Yes.
And people sometimes don't know the styled shoot world, but it's essentially a photo shoot for marketing purposes where people are literally bringing their A game at no cost. They are fronting it. So if you're a florist, you are putting your prettiest, best flowers, you are doing your best work so that they can get professional images of it, so that the Knot or Wedding Wire or Vogue Weddings will publish it and promote you.
Yeah.
So I think sometimes that also feeds into setting the expectation and just saying, okay, like we love this, but we need to potentially scale it back, right? And just like setting the expectation. I mean, you touched on that, which is it's just huge.
That's like we have a series on TikTok where I do budget breakdowns of big events that people will see on Instagram and TikTok. So many times people are like, "Oh my gosh, I can absolutely can't believe that." And I think, one thing that I feel like is a big issue in the event industry and specifically in weddings is just the complete lack of transparency. And I think that's why, I've tried to be as open and honest with clients as I can. Because even I, as someone who's 26, I'll ask my friends, how much do you think it costs, per guest for F&B, or what do you think this venue costs in the city? And they will be like so far off base. So that's why I think,
Mhm.
as you said, setting expectations early on is so key.
Well, I love that you just mentioned that you do that on TikTok. So this is one of the things I wanted to ask you about was where people can find you and follow along and learn more about your business.
Yeah, so our all of our social media handles are just at Forbes Functions on TikTok. We're on Instagram. We have our website as well, it's just ForbesFunctions.com. As been Pinterest as well, as just at Forbes Functions. I'd say we're definitely the most active on TikTok and Instagram. And TikTok, I do a lot of breakdowns into the cost different celebrity and VIP events, as well as the costs of different iconic venues in the city, the Hamptons, and kind of East Coast.
I have those links. So I'll make sure to go ahead and just let people know that I'll put that into the show notes for them. I just thank you so much for taking the time to be here today.
Thank you again for having me, Allie. This is a great conversation.